All right, we are moving on to reptiles, birds, and mammals. Still in the animal kingdom. Still, just as a reminder, we're in the domain Eukarya, and we've been talking about vertebrates so far. So here is where we have been and kind of where we're going. So we've been looking at chordates, and within the chordates, we've been looking at vertebrates. And last time we started on the amphibians, which were considered tetrapods, meaning that they have 4 limbs. So we are staying in tetrapods, and we are going to start right here with our reptiles. And what's starting to distinguish this group from what we've looked at before is the unique amniotic egg. So we're going to talk about that as well. Alright, so let's start by looking at our class Reptilia. Remember, we're in the animal kingdom and looking at vertebrates. So reptiles are pretty much exactly what you've been thinking. Lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodiles, alligators, all those things. But it also includes extinct species like dinosaurs. So let's talk about the characteristics of this class, and I specifically picked our alligator just because they're large, easy to see the various features. So in order to be in the class Reptilia, first we have to have, or not have to have, just knowing that this class involves endotherms and ectotherms. So if you'll remember correctly, ectotherms means that they're internal body temperature is dependent on the external environment. Our endotherms are those that are able to regulate their internal temperature independent of the external environment. So they're both seen in class Reptilia. Okay, but like I said, this class introduces what's called the amniotic egg, and like I said, we're going to go into detail about that in a little bit. But particularly amniotic eggs with a soft, leathery shell are representative of reptiles. They have scales or scutes. Those are 2 different things, and we're going to talk about the difference between those 2, but that makes their skin very unique. And they have what's called a cloaca. And basically that's just a common cavity at the end of the digestive tract, and it's used for excrement as well as for the excreting of genitalia products. And that's found in most vertebrates except for mammals, but this is where we start to see them come on the scene, is in the class reptiles. The other thing is their 3-chambered septated heart. Some have 4-chambered, but most of them have this unique 3-chambered septated heart. And we'll talk about that in a little bit and why it's so unique to reptiles. Last thing is that they have very well developed lungs. If you'll remember when we were looking at the amphibians, they had smaller, kind of less developed lungs, and they also relied on cutaneous respiration. So in our amphibians, the skin had to stay wet. That is not true in our reptiles. Reptiles, in fact, have dry skin, and they have well-developed lungs that are protected by a rib cage. Okay, so here's their skin. Like I said, their skin is dry, but it's thick and it's impermeable to water. So obviously they are not going to have any of that cutaneous respiration. Now, we talked about scales versus scutes. They can have either one, but in reptiles, their skin is covered by one of the 2. And scales are made up of alpha and beta keratin, usually derived from the epidermis. Fish have their scales derived from the dermis, which is a lower layer, but a scale is derived from the epidermis. And these pictures represent both scales and scutes. So let's look a little bit at the lizard scales. they're unique in that they are tube-like, and they can either be tube-like or plate-like, I should say. And they're what's called imbricate, meaning that they overlap one another. And scales on the surface have a keratinized epidermis, and then underneath they have a bony plate called an osteoderm. That term might sound a little familiar because when we were looking at the echinoderms, they had what's called ossicles, which were a bony plate. So that osteo meaning bony, so osteoderm. And scales can vary widely, allowing lizards to have different patterns, and then they can have adapted scales to perform certain functions. Like on the iguana, that spine down the back, those are all scales, but they've been modified into these spiky little scales. And then in the helmeted lizard, the ones on their head come together to form basically this helmet. So you can have modifications of the scales. All right, looking at snake scales, again, they're overlapping. And for snakes, they actually aid in locomotion. So they are used to kind of dig into the ground and propel the snake forward. They can be highly modified also, and our best example of that is the rattlesnake. That rattle on the back that warns their prey or predators that they are able to bite. They'd really prefer not to, so they try to warn their prey ahead of time. And most of you know that snakes molt their skin, so they shed their skin on a periodic basis. And that might possibly be due to growth. That has been the common thought for a long time. However, scientists have noted that it doesn't always happen during growth periods. So it's not entirely clear as to why snakes molt. One advantage, whether this is why or not, is that they can rid themselves of parasites by shedding their skin. All the parasites go with it. So that is unique to snakes. Now, their scales, being in different sizes, numbers, colors, shapes, all help to identify and classify snakes. We're not going to go into detail in that in this class, but that is a useful tool for identifying and for classifying snakes. One thing that is interesting with snakes is if you are looking at a venomous versus non-venomous snake, again, we're going to have the overlapping scales all the way down, and this is on their underside. Once you get past the anal plate, in a snake that is non-venomous, you have 2 rows of scales all the way down. In a venomous snake, you only have a single row of scales after the anal plate. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not turning any snake upside down to see if it's venomous or not. But if you were to see a dead snake, that's the way I look at it, you could identify whether it was venomous or not using this method. Now, most snakes use their scales for elaborate designs that can either allow them to camouflage themselves really well or have certain displays that are anti-predator. So this is just an example of camouflage. If we were to go hiking and pass this, we probably would never know this snake was here, and that's his goal, right? He doesn't need to be flashy and trying to bring attention to himself. So that is a lovely example of camouflage. Okay, let's talk just a little bit more about snakes, and I do have a video if you'd like to watch this one. You don't have to, but it's just kind of neat. So snakes, according to the theory of macroevolution, were thought to have evolved from lizards. And so that would imply then that they lost their legs for burrowing. And some of the evidence for that is certain snakes, like pythons and boas, still have a pelvic bone present, even though they do not have the legs for burrowing anymore. Just an interesting fact, the snake's jaws are only held together by connective tissue and by muscles. So they don't have, the bones don't actually connect. So when they go to eat their prey can be much larger than they are, and those tissues can expand to allow them to eat larger things. And that's what this video link is down at the bottom. It's really quite fascinating to watch just how big things are that snakes can eat. So if you want to go take a look at that, it's pretty interesting. Okay, we're going to move on from our snakes and lizards and talk about alligators, crocodiles, turtles, and tortoises. And so the difference between those is the two that we just looked at before, the snakes and the lizards, have scales. Now, the alligators and crocodiles, turtles, and tortoises have what we call scutes. They come from a deeper dermal layer. That's where they are produced. And unlike scales, they do not overlap. So dermal scutes are, they basically butt up to one another. They don't overlap. And there are also dermal scutes on the feet of birds, which is why they are thought to be related to our reptiles. And a turtle's shell is actually made up of large scutes. So again, coming from that deeper dermal layer. So let's talk a little bit more about turtles. The bottom of their shell is what we call a plastron, and the top is called the carapace. So carapace and plastron. And the backbone is actually fused with the carapace. So they are inseparable. Just some other neat features about turtles. Their sex is determined by their incubation temperature of their eggs. So when I was in elementary school, our science lab hatched turtle eggs, and some of them were kept in one temperature and others were kept in another, and we got to see firsthand the differences in sex based on the temperature that we incubated the eggs in. So that was pretty cool. Of course, I was in 4th grade, so I named mine Yertle after Dr. Seuss's Yertle the Turtle. You know, very creative. But anyway, it was a lot of fun. Just another little neat thing to know, turtles do not have any teeth. In fact, because they don't have teeth, they do have what's called gastroliths inside of their digestive system, which are kind of like little rocks that help to tear down the food a little bit more. Okay, so we talked before about how amphibians had much smaller lungs, not well developed, so they also use cutaneous respiration, and how reptiles have dry skin, they don't use cutaneous respiration, and that's because their lungs are much more developed, they're much larger. So if you look at that top picture right there, you can see that the reptiles do have a larger set of lungs, and they're protected by a rib cage, whereas our amphibians don't always have that rib cage, and their lungs are much smaller. So it's just some very, very neat features about reptiles. Their heart is highly adaptable. Remember, we said that they have a 3-chambered septated heart. So they still have a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. However, sorry, I circled the wrong one. Here we go. 3 parts. But they do have a septum that hangs down, so it helps to separate those 2 blood types a little bit more, so it's a little more efficient. But what's really cool is that the pulmonary arteries that go from the heart to the lungs can be restricted, and during times of inactivity, reptiles can stop breathing, stop sending so much blood to the lungs, and conserve energy. Mostly because a lot of times since they're ectothermic during cold times, they're not going to be as active, so they stop their breathing, slow down the blood flow to the lungs, and that way they can conserve energy. But when it's time to be active again, then they can restart that pumping of the blood that goes to the lungs. They can start breathing again and have more oxygen to the muscles. So they can regulate that, and that's unique to reptiles. Very cool. Okay, so here is a better look at that at the cardiovascular system. So here's our 3-chambered septated heart. So it looks very similar to our amphibians, except for this nice septum right here in the middle of the heart. So that helps to keep the deoxygenated and oxygenated blood from mixing quite as much as it does in the amphibians. So it's a step in the more efficient direction. Okay, so I mentioned that reptiles sort of have a unique digestive system. So they're very simple digestive tract: mouth, tongue, teeth, esophagus, rectum. That straight tube-like plan, complete digestive system. And then I mentioned before that some herbivores have gastroliths, and this is particularly true of tortoises and some turtles. They swallow rocks. That's what's called the gastroliths, and they help with digestion just by grinding the foliage that these tortoises and turtles eat. They have the most acidic digestive system of any animal, and some reptiles even get rid of extra salt through these glands that are near their nose. So sometimes you'll see on tortoises like this white looking streaks, and those are just salt that's being excreted. Okay, so let's talk about reproduction within reptiles. They do have internal fertilization of an amniotic egg. And we are going to talk about what that amniotic egg is, I promise. There are 3 different types of births, and we've talked about this before when we looked at our class Chondrichthyes, if you remember that. So to be familiar with these, class Reptile does show each of these. We have oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. Most of the time with our reptiles, we are going to be having oviparous. Okay, so let's look at this amniotic egg. That means that the embryo has 4 extra embryonic membranes. Okay, so here we go. We are taking a look at an amniotic egg. So just to start with, our embryo is right here in the center. And there we go, our lovely embryo. And keeping in mind that in the egg we need to still be getting rid of carbon dioxide and be able to let oxygen come through. So to start with, we have our yolk sac. And that is just where lots of nutrients are stored that help to feed the embryo. That's one of the extra embryonic membranes. Number 2 is what's called the allantois. That contains the embryo's waste. So this whole kind of pink section here, that's where the embryo's waste goes, and this is where gas exchange occurs, allowing carbon dioxide to go out and oxygen to come in. The third is what we call the amnion, and that is a fluid-filled sac that protects the embryo. So you'll see right here, it surrounds the embryo, just allows for dampening of vibrations and that sort of thing. So it's called the amnion. And the 4th is the chorion, and again, gas exchange occurs here as well. And so that is this whole layer here, just inside. Now, other parts of the egg that are important are this sort of space between the chorion and the shell, and that is about 90% water and 10% albumin, which is a protein. And again, it allows for extra cushioning of the embryo and all of its important extra embryonic membranes. Of course, we have the egg shell that particularly in our reptiles is sort of a leathery feeling to it. And then there's always a place where we have air space as well. So those are all the parts of the amniotic egg. And this is just another picture of the same things. This in the top left, just to give you an example of what it looks like in real life. This is an alligator egg. So there's your embryo. And if you're looking over to the right, here's your air pocket, your shell, your chorion, your albumin, your allantois, and your amnion. And in this particular picture, the vitellus, that's your yolk sac. That's another name for it. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of diversity within reptiles and the relationships between them according to the theories. So we have amphibians, we think, that then led to the various reptiles. So we have our particular dinosaurs, the therapsids, that are now extinct, that were thought to give rise to the mammals. Amphibians leading straight to turtles, lizards, and lizards then giving way to snakes. We talked about that. The dinosaurs that are thecodonts that are extinct are thought to have given rise to crocodiles. And then other extinct dinosaurs giving rise to birds. So according to this, then, birds and mammals would be descendants of reptiles as well. So here is the phylogeny, noting all of these mammals that we talked about. So this is the same thing you just looked at in the previous slide, just kind of represented differently. And I have included a link on Sakai to an article that sort of explains the thought process of how they thought this came to be, so y'all can read that and decide for yourselves what you think. So we're going to stay in this class within the reptiles, and what's closely related to it, and you don't see it on this chart, are the birds. So they are still tetrapods because the wings are modified versions of those front limbs. And like we said, they have scutes on their feet, or at least some of them do. And so we're going to talk about a group that's at least closely related, supposedly, to the reptiles, called class Aves. So these are birds. They are definitely designed for flight. So I have over here in blue the particular features of birds that allow them to fly. They're modifications that allow for a very lightweight, strong body. So they have no urinary bladder. They have very small gonads. So even in the females, they only have one ovary. They don't have teeth. Obviously, they have wings. They have very hollow bones, kind of a honeycomb structure. They have a keel on their sternum, so that on their chest where the muscle wings attach. And being a keel, it can also help it to be more aerodynamic. And of course, they have feathers. Now, the additional features in the class Aves that aren't unique to flight, but are again necessary for them to be in class Aves, is they have a hard-shelled amniotic egg. So when we were looking at the other reptiles, they had that leathery amniotic egg. Now we have a hard shell. And they have a 4-chambered heart, and they are endothermic. So they regulate their body temperature independent of the external environment. Okay, so some really cool features unique to birds. They do have a larynx, but it's not used for vocals. They have what's called a syrinx, which is just past the larynx, that they use for vocalization. So whereas you and I would use the larynx for vocals, they have something in addition to that called a syrinx. So if we're looking at our bird anatomy, some of the important features are, here's our sternum with the keel. And you'll see this in lab. We have some skeletons that you can take a look at for that. As we said, the forelimb is modified into wings. They have a very lightweight skeletal system. They do have their nostrils and lungs. Just when you're looking at all of this, you notice that all the features are pretty tiny, except for their muscles. They have large muscles. And of course they have their feathers that have a shaft with barbs and barbules. And I think we're going to take a look a little bit at feather anatomy in just a minute. But let's look at the way that they breathe. It's actually very unique. Birds have about 7 to 9 air sacs in addition to the lungs. So some of the air sacs even extend into their bones, like into the leg bones. And unique to birds, they don't have a diaphragm. Whereas you and I have a diaphragm that when it drops down, it draws air into our lungs, and as it pushes back up, it pushes air back out of our lungs. There's no diaphragm in a bird. Instead, pressure changes in the air sacs are used for that gas exchange. And those air sacs, like I said, are all throughout their body. You can see that in these pictures over here on the left. So here are the different pairs of air sacs in addition to the lungs. So what happens is muscles in their chest push out the sternum. Okay, so when the sternum gets pushed out, that causes a negative pressure that allows for inhalation in through the lungs and into the air sacs. As the muscles contract around the various air sacs, and they have them all over, that causes positive pressure for then exhalation. So the gas exchange still occurs in the lungs, but all these additional air sacs help to bring more air in and then to push it back through the lungs. And that gas exchange occurs on the exhale. So they're very efficient, and they're actually a little more efficient than we are as far as gas exchange goes in the lungs. Okay, so we said that feathers are unique to birds, and feathers are basically modified scales. So the scales that we saw in reptiles, these are modifications. They come from the epidermis, and there are different types. They're all arranged in particular rows that allow the bird to be very aerodynamic and sleek. So there are 3 different types. There's contour feathers, flight feathers, and down feathers. So the contour feathers are what cover most of the surface of the bird, and it allows for protection from sun, wind, and rain. And then it also has color patterns that are helpful for mating displays. Then our flight feathers are exactly that. They are what allows for birds to fly. They're very large, and they're strong and interlock with each other to allow for wind resistance. They're divided into tail feathers and remiges, which are the flight feathers on the wings. And then there are the down feathers. And most of you know what down is. That small, soft, fluffy feathers that are located under the contour feathers. And they're used for insulation to keep the birds warm, and because the birds are endotherms. And these are the ones, of course, that we use in our jackets or our pillows or that sort of thing. So they're very soft and help in insulation. So when we look at feather anatomy, when we look at this one particular, we have the central shaft right here, and it's hollow because remember, everything we do has to be lightweight. And then, as I mentioned before, we have the hollow shaft with the barbs and barbules attached. So each of these barbules have these little tiny hooklets that come out, And that's what allows the feathers to stay together. And I'm sure as a kid you probably messed with them, you know, they get all torn apart, and then you run your fingers this way to make them all smooth again. That's because those hooklets, when you run your fingers up the shaft, are hooking back together. So when you see a bird stopping to preen itself, usually it's because it's putting those hooklets back together. That's what allows them to be aerodynamic, to allow that wind resistance as they're flying. So that's what happens when birds are preening themselves. So this is I just wanted to show you a little bit about their wings, because again, they're modified forelimbs. So here we even have a wrist with palms and fingers that come out. Those are those types of bones. And so here is like their scapula, and then here are the different feathers. So we have their marginal coverts is what they're called. That's on that front side of the wing. It's really important that the hooklets stay put together there for sure. And then they have these distinct rows of feathers in all birds. And all of these allow for flight. So when we look at wings, this is how the Wright brothers got their idea for flight, for human flight, was looking at the design of bird wings and how aerodynamic they are and where the air flows over them. And it wasn't just the Wright brothers. All of the early pioneers in human flight were studying bird wings in particular. So just wanted you to look at some of these altitudes. Most of our birds are going to be down here in this zone right here. And that's also where commercial airlines pressurize their cabins for this particular altitude, 0 to 2,000 meters. But there are some birds that can fly higher. So humans start to feel dizziness right here around 4,500 meters. So just for reference, Everest is 8,848 meters high. And there are a few birds that can fly up and over Everest. So that altitude, you just get a rare type of bird that can do that. And of course, it's all going to depend on those lungs and air sacs. So here's a look at the skeleton of a bird. And we talked about how pretty much everything on a bird is designed for flight. So if we look at the human bone versus a bird bone, ours are very dense. We need it to be strong and firm, and we don't have to be lightweight with our bones. But there are large air pockets in a bird bone, and that's why oftentimes they're called like a honeycomb type of bone. So here you go, large air pockets. And then of course the distinguishing feature is that keel that allows for the wing muscles to attach, and also it works like a rudder on a boat for when you're needing to steer. That keel sternum works for that as well. And this is just to show you the diversity of beaks. This is such a variety, and it has to do with what the birds are eating. They're well adapted for it. Some are for catching fish, like your pelicans that you are familiar with. There are nutcrackers, there are spear type beaks, there are those that are digging up worms. So there's a lot of beak modification. So are birds intelligent? I am going to have you take a look at this video if you'll click over on that. I will tell you that I'm not sure I could have figured out all of the information that this bird does, but very fascinating. Click on that link and take a look at that video. Okay, now we're going to move into what everybody is familiar with, which is class Mammalia. Again, we are still in the tetrapods. We still have amniotic eggs. So what makes mammals unique? Most of this is going to be something that you learned probably in elementary school. We seem to all learn this one pretty early. So our class Mammalia, of course, we have hair, mammary glands, we have a 4-chambered heart. The skeleton includes differentiated teeth, so you actually know what the diet of a particular animal is based on the types of teeth that are present. The legs are underneath the body, not out to the side like we saw with the frogs and other amphibians. And they have internal development, meaning that the young are born alive after a period of development in utero. So there are 3 categories of mammals. There are monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians, which are our placental mammals. So here we go. Just some examples real quickly of each. Our monotremes, like our platypus. Our marsupials have that front pocket. And eutherial or placental mammals, there's a large variety of those. So let's start with our monotremes. Mono, because they only have one opening for the digestive, urinary, and reproductive system. That's why they're called monotremes. And that one opening is the cloaca, which you should have remembered from our reptiles. That is a feature that carries over into this particular group of mammals called the monotremes. So there are only 3 species within this group. That's the platypus and 2 types of anteaters. We find these monotremes mostly in Australia and New Guinea, and they still lay eggs with a leathery shell. So that's a different way of mammalian birth than most of the mammals that we are used to. So normally when we think of mammary glands, we think of babies latching directly onto the nipple and drinking milk, but monotremes are a little different. Their mammary glands release milk onto the fur, and then the babies either suck or lick the fur instead of directly on the nipple. Very different. So here's what they look like, our platypus on the left and our 2 different anteaters on the right. Okay, our marsupials, those are our mammals with the patches. And everybody knows that's the koalas, right? It's also the opossums, kangaroos, and Tasmanian devils. We pretty much only have the opossums here in the U.S. Once these babies are born, they're usually born pretty early, and they go directly into the pouch and attach to a nipple in the pouch. So here is what they look like for those of you who may not know. So we have, of course, our koala up here on the left, and this is a Tasmanian devil if you didn't know what they looked like, and then our kangaroos. Okay, and then our third group is our eutherians, or our placental mammals, and these are the ones that you are the most familiar with. We are a eutherian. Dogs, whales, bats, these lovely porcupines, zebras, walruses. What makes this group unique is the placenta, and that is an organ that's made up of uterine lining plus the extra embryonic membranes. Remember, we've talked about those before with the amniotic egg? Yep, this is where that comes into play. Okay, so this is what the placenta actually looks like. Right here, and where it's located is right here next to the inside of the uterus, on the inside lining of the uterus, and this is where gas exchange and waste exchange takes place from the fetus. Now, there are all kinds of different things that different tribal groups and people groups do with the placenta. It's a very nutrient-rich organ. And of course, once the baby's delivered, it the placenta is delivered as well. And so in some cultures, it's common to take the placenta and do various things with it. Either in some cultures, people will bury it. In some cultures, it's boiled and the water is to be drunk because it's thought to help induce milk production. Other cultures, people eat it because it's high in nutrition. Even in our culture, some people will bank the placenta if there's a need for it later. Oftentimes in the U.S., it's just part of the delivery and it goes in the waste. But just be aware that that is just a very interesting organ, and I find it fascinating that different cultures actually do different things with it. So that might be worth looking into if that piques your curiosity. Okay, within mammals, of course, there are a lot of what we call orders. And so I've highlighted primates here. That's where monkeys are. That's actually where humans are classified as well. And the other one that I just wanted us to take a look at is cetacea. And yes, that's because it's a personal preference of mine. So I just want to take a quick look at it. So order cetacea is going to be the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And they are completely adapted for life in the water, but they are still mammals. They are streamlined for swimming, but they do breathe air. They have that blowhole on the top. They give birth to live young. They still nurse their young as well. And this is one of the reasons I wanted us to just take a look at it for a quick second, because I think sometimes we don't think about what's in the ocean and think about how vast and large the ocean is. We've talked before about how much it covers the earth. So here is just a variety of whales that are present in our oceans. They can be huge, like your blue whale that I'm sure you've talked about since you were young, all the way down to fairly small porpoises. I was actually standing in line one time and a lady behind me was laughing that her niece called a dolphin a whale. And she was just laughing, and she's like, thinking, stupid niece, that's not true. And her boyfriend just said, well, do you know for sure that dolphins aren't whales? And she's like, oh, I'm sure they're not. She's like, no, everybody knows they're not. And I held my tongue because I didn't want to say anything. But while I was standing there, she started looking it up on her phone, and she was like, oh, they're a type of toothed whale. And I tried really hard not to laugh. But anyway, so her niece had more information than she did. Okay, so let's look at the order primates. So we have apes, we have monkeys, we have humans. So what are the characteristics that make primates primates? First is our opposable thumb and having a big toe. So even in this image, you can see the opposable thumb of the different primates. And then we also have nails instead of claws. That makes us a little bit different. And then a limber shoulder joint. So we have a ball and socket. Not everybody has that. Super important for me because I use that a lot in kayaking, right? Monkeys use it for getting through trees. The fourth is that we have eyes on the front of our head, not out to the side, and this is particularly good for depth perception. And because of that, we have a smaller snout or nose, some people smaller than others. But in this image here, this out here would be considered your peripheral vision. So you still see those things out to the side. But in the center is the binocular vision, and that's where depth perception is its best. And in order for that to occur, this nose has to be small because that angle has to be able to come out and cross each other. So that reduced nose helps with that as well. Typically, we have single births. We don't have a litter, in other words. And for monkeys, that makes it easier to get through trees. You can have one baby on your back instead of 12. You couldn't get through a tree with that. And then we tend to have larger, more complex brains. Now, it's not usually just the size of the brain that makes the animal more intelligent. There has been some studies that show that it's the amount of infoldings, so the more surface area they have, the more complex thought is available. None of that's really proven yet. Right now, that's still just some findings that are early on, and they're still... Okay, so what makes humans unique? I want you to just stop for a second, put pen to paper, and just think about what you think makes a human a human. I wish that I could see what you wrote down for what makes humans unique. That is my one disadvantage of doing these lectures online. I always get excited about how you guys think and wanting to know what you believe and what makes humans unique to you. So if you feel like it, email me your answers. It's not an assignment, but I'm just interested. So here are some things that scientists say are unique to humans. The first is bipedalism, so being able to walk upright on two limbs. Language, whether that be oral or written, or both. And then Tomasello, in his book A Natural History of Human Thinking, wrote about joint intentionality of thought, and it's a much higher level of thinking. So it requires that if there's a task, that the collaborators recognize that each has a certain special perspective on that task, and then with unshared knowledge that must be supplied to the other collaborators to complete the task successfully. And so what that implies is that the individuals understand that the others in the group not only have beliefs, but that those others' beliefs might be false. And so we don't see that level of thinking in other animals. That's very unique to humans. And the other thing that living here in the Bible Belt, I'm sure some of you have said, is that humans are made in God's image, and that is also an acceptable answer. So I'm just interested to see what you guys said about that. So send me your answers. I'd love to see it. But that concludes this portion of the lecture. Next time we're going to talk about comparative anatomy, and that will finish up our unit on the animal kingdom.